No one is truly prepared for the feeling of being under the control of the unknown. Alejandra never could have imagined that her life, once peaceful and entirely devoted to her family, could be consumed by something she couldn't see, touch, or fully understand. For her, it all started with small changes: a persistent cold, a son whose silence became unnerving, shadows that seemed to move in the corners of the house. These things at first didn't seem connected, but gradually they wove together into a web of fear and confusion. These were times of uncertainty, where family life began to crumble under the weight of an illness that seemed common, but carried with it an imperceptible presence. The subtle, stealthy evil had already infiltrated their home long before Alejandra realized it. The walls, which once offered her protection, now surrounded her like an invisible prison. Something was lurking in her home, something that didn't belong in this world, something her mind refused to accept. As her husband Raul's health deteriorated, Alejandra did everything she could to maintain control. The nights were filled with hallucinations and feverish delirium. Raul spoke of nonsensical things, impossible visions. But what disturbed Alejandra most wasn't her sick husband's delirious words, but the whispers from her son. In a trembling voice, the boy would say, "Mom, there's a boy who follows me." That simple sentence pierced Alejandra's heart like a cold blade. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would forever alter their lives. Deep down, Alejandra knew that something older and darker than any illness had entered their home. It was an evil that had crept in unnoticed, as silent as a shadow sliding along the edge of your vision, but as devastating as an impending storm. She tried to find a rational explanation, but the truth that emerged was far more terrifying than she could ever have imagined. Deciding to return to Mexico seemed like the only option. However, what awaited Alejandra and her family in their homeland would be even more frightening than any fever or delirium. Buried secrets, unforgivable betrayals, and an invisible darkness stalked them, ready to consume them. Because sometimes, what pursues you doesn't come from the outside, but from deep within yourself. And when fear takes shape, escaping is no longer an option. Alejandra used to look at Raul with growing concern. At first it seemed like a common cold, but soon his health began to unravel alarmingly. It all started with a sore throat, which forced him to gargle warm salt water several times a day. Then came the high fevers, so intense that they plunged him into delirium at night. Desperate, Alejandra tried to cool him down with cold compresses, but nothing seemed to work. Her husband, the strong and determined man she had once known, was fading before her eyes, and she felt powerless. Raul's headaches became so severe that he couldn't bear the daylight. In his exhausted face, Alejandra saw the reflection of a man broken by constant suffering. Raul stopped working. He spent his days lying in bed or on the couch, staring blankly, as if a shadow was devouring his spirit. The house, once filled with laughter, now wrapped in a heavy silence, interrupted only by her husband's groans. Alejandra had no choice but to return to her cleaning jobs. There was no other option. The bills piled up, and the financial pressure increased each day. Desperate, she was forced to leave her son in Raul's care, even though she knew her husband could barely take care of himself. There was no one else to turn to. The first day she left the boy with Raul, something changed in the child. When Alejandra returned home, the boy ran to her and hugged her with unusual strength. His gaze, filled with fear, deeply unsettled Alejandra. That week, the boy clung to Alejandra every time she returned from work. His silence was unsettling. Although Alejandra asked what was wrong, he only shook his head. He seemed terrified of something he didn't dare mention. One afternoon, while Alejandra was making dinner, her son approached her, trembling. "Mom, something follows me when Dad falls asleep," he murmured with a broken voice. "It looks like me, but its hand is burned and its face is wrong." Her son's words sent a chill down Alejandra's spine. She tried to reassure him, thinking it was just the imagination of a little boy projecting his fears amid the family chaos. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The coincidences were disturbing, but she decided not to tell Raul, fearing it would only worsen his condition. Seeking more peace of mind, Alejandra decided to leave her son in the care of a neighbor. She knew Raul was not in a state to look after the boy, and the stories he told disturbed her deeply. The neighbor was someone trustworthy, and Alejandra felt a sense of relief knowing her son would be safe while she worked. However, the fear persisted. Her son continued talking about the boy with the burned hand, and it began to unsettle her even more. Meanwhile, Raúl's health continued to deteriorate rapidly. He began talking to himself, mumbling nonsense in the middle of the night. One early morning, Alejandra found him sitting in the living room, staring at the door. "I saw him," he murmured when he saw her enter. "Our son was walking around the house, but there was something strange about him." Alejandra felt a knot form in her throat upon hearing this. Raúl described the boy exactly as their son had, with a burned hand and a disfigured face. Alejandra tried to find a rational explanation for what was happening. Perhaps Raúl's hallucinations and their son's stories were just an unfortunate coincidence. Maybe the fevers were distorting Raúl's perception, making him confuse his dreams with reality. But the more she tried to convince herself of this, the more a deep sense of fear grew inside her. The house, once her refuge, now felt like a prison filled with shadows. Raúl, growing weaker by the day, began to suffer from panic attacks. "There's something in the house," he frequently repeated. "Something that shouldn't be here." Alejandra listened with a heavy heart, unsure of how to help him. Despair consumed her. She didn't know if her husband's delirium was caused by the fever, or if something dark was indeed happening in their home. The only thing she knew for certain was that her life, as she knew it, was falling apart. Days dragged on with excruciating slowness. Raúl continued to decline, and his hallucinations became increasingly disturbing. Alejandra noticed that the shadows in the house seemed to grow denser, as if the walls themselves were absorbing her husband's life force. There was a constant feeling that something was watching her, an invisible presence moving between the hallways and rooms. Alejandra tried to ignore that feeling, but the atmosphere in the house became more oppressive each day. One afternoon, while Raúl slept, Alejandra heard a noise in the hallway. It was a soft sound, like someone walking slowly. Thinking it was her son, she went to check, but found him playing in the backyard. When she returned to the hallway, the sound was gone. She decided not to mention anything to Raúl. She didn't want to add more worries to his already burdened mind. But that night, as they lay in bed, Raúl whispered to her, "You heard it, didn't you? We're not alone." Alejandra felt a shiver run down her spine. She didn't respond, pretending she hadn't heard anything. But deep inside, something told her that something truly strange was happening. The incidents with her son continued. "The boy is here again," he would whisper softly as he clung to her at night. "He's standing in the doorway." Alejandra would reassure him, telling him it was just a bad dream, but she was beginning to doubt her own words. Determined to protect her family, Alejandra resolved to return to Mexico. She felt that, far from that house, they might be able to start anew. The situation was unsustainable. Raúl could no longer work, and their savings were controlled by his mother. Alejandra suspected something was wrong with the money, but she attributed it to the stress caused by Raúl's illness. When they finally decided to return, Alejandra thought the worst was over. Their reunion with Raúl's parents was an emotional mix. Raúl's mother welcomed them with open arms, but Alejandra noticed something had changed in her father-in-law. He seemed thinner, paler, and there was a shadow in his eyes that she couldn't ignore. Although she tried to brush it off, she soon realized the atmosphere in that house was just as heavy as the one they had left behind. It seemed as though the darkness had followed them there. One night, while everyone was asleep, Alejandra got up to get a glass of water. The kitchen was completely silent, interrupted only by the creaking of the wooden floor beneath her feet. As she approached the window, she saw something that froze her with fear. Her father-in-law was sitting on the porch swing, gently swaying. In front of him, among the garden's shadows, a tall, dark figure moved from side to side, as if waiting. Alejandra stood paralyzed, watching the scene with her heart racing. Her father-in-law's face appeared calm, but his hands, clasping a rosary, trembled slightly. The figure in the garden made no sound, but its presence was suffocating. Alejandra stepped back, unable to take her eyes off the silhouette that seemed to come closer and closer to the house. The feeling of being watched intensified in the following days. Alejandra avoided going into the garden at night, and although she didn't speak of what she had seen, she couldn't get it out of her mind. She felt that the dark figure was drawing nearer, and soon it would cross the threshold of the house. It was during those days that Raoul, weakened by his illness, suffered his worst attack. He woke up in the middle of the night screaming, his eyes wild, pointing to an empty corner of the room. Alejandra tried to calm him, but Raoul insisted there was something there, something coming for him. "It's here," he shouted in desperation. "It's coming for me." That same night they took him to the hospital, but nothing could soothe his torment. Alejandra knew that something more than just an illness was taking her husband's life. There was a dark force that had infiltrated their lives, slowly destroying them from within. Raoul passed away in the hospital a few weeks later. His death left Alejandra in deep sadness, but also with the unsettling feeling that the nightmare was far from over. The shadow she had seen in the garden, the creature her son described, and Raoul's hallucinations couldn't be mere coincidences. Something evil had entered their lives, and Alejandra feared it wouldn't leave so easily. After Raoul's death, Alejandra tried to rebuild her life. Her son had become her only priority, but things weren't easy. The house of Raoul's parents, which had once been a refuge, now felt oppressive, as if something dark lurked in every corner. Alejandra couldn't stop thinking about the figure she had seen in the garden, and though she tried to move on, the feeling of being watched never left her. Every night, Alejandra woke with a start, her heart racing, as if someone had called her from the darkness. She would look at her son sleeping beside her, but the fear wouldn't dissipate. More than once she thought she saw a shadow moving across the room, but when she turned on the light, there was nothing, only the silence of the night and the soft whisper of the wind through the windows. One early morning, while trying to sleep, she heard the creaking of the porch swing again. She knew what that meant, and though she didn't want to face what she might see, she couldn't help but get up. She walked slowly toward the window, her heart in her throat. She pulled the curtain slightly, and there was her father-in-law sitting on the swing, his hands raised as if praying silently. But what truly terrified her was the figure standing in front of him. The silhouette, taller and darker than ever, moved slowly from side to side, like a hunter stalking its prey. Her father-in-law said nothing, but his face was tense, and his hands, holding the rosary, visibly shook. Alejandra felt a knot in her stomach. That thing wasn't human. She knew it deep within her soul. Alejandra slowly stepped back, never taking her eyes off the figure until she was far enough away. She closed the bedroom door and sat beside her son, who slept peacefully. She tried to calm herself, but she couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen. She knew her father-in-law was facing something beyond logic, something that was devouring their family from the shadows. Days passed, and though Alejandra tried to stay calm, tensions in the house grew. Her father-in-law looked weaker and more tired with each passing day. He barely spoke, and when he did, his words were vague and confused. His wife, Raoul's mother, seemed affected as well, but her main concern was Alejandra and her grandson. "Don't take him away from us," she begged one night, tears in her eyes. "Please don't cut us out of his life." Alejandra couldn't promise anything. The pain of losing Raoul was still fresh, and the betrayal of her in-laws for spending their savings filled her with rage. But beyond that, she felt that staying in that house wasn't safe. Something evil was still lurking, and Alejandra feared more for her son than anything else. She knew she had to leave, but she didn't want to go without first ensuring her mother-in-law would be safe. One night, after talking to her mother-in-law about the possibility of leaving, Alejandra woke up with a start. Her son was standing by the bed, tears in his eyes. "Mom, there's something here," he whispered, trembling. Alejandra looked around the room, but saw nothing. Even so, the fear in her son's eyes was enough to make her believe that, indeed, something was there. She tried to comfort him, but the boy insisted that someone had touched him while he slept. Alejandra hugged him tightly, but inside, a voice told her that something very dark was still stalking her family. That night, she couldn't go back to sleep. Every shadow she saw in the room made her shiver, and the air felt thick, heavy with a negative energy that seemed to suffocate her. The next morning, Alejandra made a decision. They had to leave. There was something in that house that would never allow them to find peace. Although she felt guilty about leaving her mother-in-law alone, she knew that the best thing for her and her son was to start anew. Far from that place, and the memories that haunted her. Alejandra began making plans to leave as soon as possible, without looking back. The day Alejandra finally decided to leave her in-laws' house dawned cold and bleak. The atmosphere in the house had changed since Raul's death, but that day in particular, the air seemed filled with something more than sadness. As she prepared breakfast, Justino, her father-in-law, approached her with such a somber expression that it sent a shiver down Alejandra's spine. For days, she had avoided him as much as possible, unable to look at him without feeling a mixture of anger and disgust. "I need to talk to you," Justino said in a grave, almost whispering voice. Though uncomfortable, Alejandra agreed. They sat at the small kitchen table, and Justino, after taking a deep breath, began to speak. What he said next would completely change the way Alejandra saw everything that had happened. He confessed that he had been the one responsible for spending Raul's savings. He had taken the money without his son's knowledge to pay off a debt that wasn't just financial, but also spiritual. At first, Alejandra thought Justino was just making excuses to justify his betrayal. But as he continued with his story, Alejandra's skin prickled. Justino hadn't just borrowed money from Gaspar, a dangerous man known for his shady dealings, but he had also agreed to a pact with him. "It wasn't just money he took from me," Justino confessed through tears. "It was something more, something I never should have allowed." According to Justino, Gaspar wasn't an ordinary man. He had connections to what he described as dark forces. At first, Justino didn't pay attention to the rumors, but soon he began to notice that every time he received a loan from Gaspar, strange things happened in his life. He would lose money in inexplicable ways, his health rapidly deteriorated, and the shadows that started to circle his home terrified him more than any debt. "I saw that thing before Raul got sick," Justino admitted, nervously wringing his hands, a shadow that walked around the house, moving as if it was waiting for something or someone. Alejandra shuddered at hearing those words. It was exactly what she had seen in the garden. Justino continued explaining that the dark figure wasn't just a ghost or hallucination, but a messenger sent by Gaspar to collect the debt he had incurred, a debt that wasn't just about money. Justino's confession became even more chilling when he mentioned that after accepting Gaspar's loan, his nightmares began to grow more vivid. He dreamed of his grandson and his son, but there was always fire and a burned arm. The most terrifying part was that those nightmares began to come true. Raul's visions and their sons were reflections of Justino's dreams, as if they were all connected to that dark debt. Alejandra tried to stay composed as Justino continued talking, but her fear was growing. "Raul knew," Justino said in a hoarse voice. "He knew something dark was stalking us. That's why he left so quickly." Justino broke down in tears, completely shattered. "It's my fault. I brought it here. I brought that darkness into our lives." Alejandra couldn't believe what she was hearing. Everything she had experienced, from Raul's illness to her son's hallucinations, made sense in a terrifying way. Her father-in-law had been responsible for it all, and now that darkness seemed to have caught up with them. Though Alejandra wanted to scream at him, something in Justino's desperation stopped her. The man was as broken as she was. The most unsettling part of the confession was when Justino admitted that he knew there was no escape. "It's my turn," he murmured, his eyes hollow. "I know it. That thing took him first, but it will come for me next." Terrified and confused, Alejandra stood up from the table. She couldn't listen any longer. She didn't want to believe that something so dark had held so much power over her family. With a trembling voice, Justino begged Alejandra to take her son and leave as far away as possible. "Don't stay here, please," he pleaded. "That thing hasn't touched you or your son yet, but if you stay, it will." Though Justino's words were filled with desperation, Alejandra knew he was right. She had to leave. She couldn't allow that darkness to consume them as well. Alejandra left her in-laws' house the next day, taking only what was necessary. She didn't want long goodbyes or to give explanations. She just wanted to get as far away from that house, from that broken family, and from the shadows that seemed to have followed her from the other side. As the bus drove away from the town, Alejandra looked one last time at the house she had shared with Raul. She knew she would never return, not even if they offered her all the money in the world. The journey to her mother's house was long and silent. Her son slept beside her, oblivious to everything that had happened, but Alejandra couldn't stop thinking about what Justino had confessed. It was as if, suddenly, everything made sense, yet at the same time, nothing did. How had they gotten to this point? How could someone bring so much evil into their lives without realizing it? When they arrived at her mother's house, Alejandra felt a slight sense of relief, though the feeling that something dark was still stalking them didn't entirely disappear. She settled in with her son and began to rebuild her life. However, the nights were still difficult. Sometimes she heard footsteps in the hallways or felt that someone was watching her while she slept. Though she told herself it was just the echoes of her fear, she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness hadn't stayed behind. Days after settling in, Alejandra received a call that shook her to the core. Her mother-in-law called, crying. Justino had died. It wasn't natural, the woman sobbed. Something took him. I saw it. Alejandra felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't need any more explanations. She knew what had happened. That dark figure that had been stalking Justino had finally fulfilled its promise. Justino's funeral was brief, but Alejandra chose not to attend. She couldn't go back to that house, not after everything that had happened. Instead, she prayed for him and Raul from a distance, hoping they both found peace, though deep down, she knew that the darkness that had claimed them wouldn't easily release their souls. The fear still haunted her mind, though she tried to stay strong for her son. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Alejandra began to build a new life with her son, but the nightmares persisted. She dreamed of Raul, with his lost gaze, always pointing toward something she couldn't see. The shadows in her dreams chased her, but the most terrifying part was that her son had started having the same dreams. "Dad is in the shadow," he told her one night, scared. "He can't get out." Alejandra tried taking her son to a priest, hoping that a blessing might free them from these visions, but nothing seemed to work. It was as if something had marked her family forever, a stain they couldn't erase. Though she tried to hold on to her faith, doubt was beginning to take hold. What if everything Justino had said was true? What if that darkness was still stalking them, waiting for the right moment to strike again? Despite her efforts to protect her son, Alejandra knew that something else was at play. She felt it in the way the shadows moved around the house, in the heaviness of the air at night. Even in the calmest moments, she couldn't help but look over her shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the dark. She knew that the most important thing was to keep her son safe, but sometimes she felt powerless to fight against something she couldn't see. Finally, one day, Alejandra decided that she had to face whatever was following them. She couldn't keep running forever. She knew that the only way to find peace was to confront the shadows, even if she didn't know how. As she watched her son play in the yard, she felt a momentary calm, as if, for a brief instant, the darkness had retreated. But she knew it wouldn't last long. The shadows always came back,